All right, we'll get started now. Hello, everyone. My name is Kat Romano, and I'm the Programming and Human Rights Coordinator at the Montreal Holocaust Museum. I want to welcome everyone to our event, Virtual Book Talk, Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, on Roma and Sinti Genocide Remembrance Day. August 2nd is an important date as it marks the anniversary of the murder of thousands of Roma and Sinti in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Today and every day, we honor their memory. For this event, we're so grateful to our partners, Romanipe and the Jewish Public Library. Romanipe is a nonprofit organization whose main mission is to defend the dignity and human rights of Roma worldwide. In the spirit of human rights advocacy, they strive to address the tangible human rights issues that emerge from real experiences lived by Roma, widespread misrepresentation, prejudice, discrimination, and racism. They seek to do so by proactively creating opportunities for self-organization, participation, and inclusion in civil society. Fighting racism and securing rights for Roma refugees to Canada is an important objective for the organization. The Jewish Public Library is a public library in Montreal founded in 1914. The library contains the largest circulating collection of Judaica in North America. The JPL is a locally and globally accessible resource for sharing Jewish culture, history, and literature, and advances learning, research, and discovery in a warm and inclusive environment. Here at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, we aim to educate people of all ages and backgrounds about the Holocaust while sensitizing the public to the universal perils of anti-Semitism, racism, hate, and indifference. Through our commemorative programs, educational initiatives, the museum promotes respect for diversity and the sanctity of human life. If you're in Montreal, we invite you to visit our permanent exhibition, as well as visiting our website to explore our virtual exhibits and survivor testimonies. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to go over a bit of housekeeping. So everyone will be kept on mute throughout the whole event. The conversation that's going to happen today will be followed by a Q&A, during which you'll be able to ask questions by writing them in the chat. If you think of questions while the discussion is happening, feel free to write them in the chat and I'll be monitoring it throughout. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message me directly and I'll try my best to help you. I'm not an IT specialist, but I'll do my best. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. So Ari Joskowicz is a historian with a special interest in the complicated relations between different minority groups. He is an associate professor of Jewish Studies and History at Vanderbilt University and chair of the Department of Jewish Studies. He's the author of Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, the book that we'll be discussing today, which appeared this year with Princeton University Press. And he's also the author of The Modernity of Others, Jewish Anti-Catholicism in Germany and France, which was published in 2014. He also published widely on Jewish intellectual history, Romani history, and the digital humanities. He has held fellowships from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, among others. And Dr. Ioanida Costache is a Romani violinist, video artist, and scholar. She is an assistant professor of ethnomusicology at Stanford University. Her research traces the legacy of Romani historical trauma inscribed in Romani music, sound, and art. Her writing has been published in Europe Now, Revista Arta, Critical Romani Studies, and European History Quarterly. She has held visiting fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the USC Shoah Foundation. We're so pleased to have both of our speakers here today, and I'll spotlight them and let the discussion begin. And I'm just gonna spotlight Ari. And there we go.
Thank you so much, Kat. Thank you for the organizers for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here today with Ari. honored to be in conversation with him about his new book about Roma Jews in the Holocaust. This book means a lot, not only to me, but I think I can speak on behalf of a lot of Romani people, that this book means a lot to us and to forwarding Holocaust memory. So thank you for writing it, and I'm happy to be here with you today. As Kat already mentioned, today is Roma Holocaust Memorial Day. So I thought we could start, Ari, if you'd be, so generous to kind of give us an overview of what this day means, what it commemorates, what's the kind of history of the day. And then we can kind of launch into talking more about the book.
And it's really my honor to be here on this day and with you on this incredibly important day for the Romani community, and I think for anybody who cares about the Holocaust. So August 2nd, 1944 was a day when the remaining inmates of a subcamp of Auschwitz in Auschwitz-Birkenau were all murdered. So 3,400 Roma were murdered in this camp in a single night. It's a night that actually many other inmates of the camp remembered as well as one of the worst nights they experienced. It's the largest single mass murder event, I would say, affecting Roma during the Holocaust, and is a central location both of the murder and of the memory of that murder. It stands in for a lot of other locations as well, other camps, ghettos, and a lot of killing sites that are all across Europe, where Roma were taught very often by Einsatzgruppen, so the special mobile killing squads in the occupied Soviet Union, or by local police, in fact, in other places. As with the Holocaust Memorial Day on January 27th, which is also commemorated by many Roma, I should add, which is the liberation of Auschwitz, this day sort of identifies one central location and really reminds us of a much larger killing process that we want to commemorate. And it also has become a moment when many Roma in Europe, in particular, travel to Auschwitz to commemorate together. So it's become an event for many, so for the remaining survivors, the few who are still there, to come together, but also their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who get introduced to the story of their community at that location. I went to the 70th anniversary of that night of August 2nd in 2014, and it was an incredibly important event for me and the Romani community. Actually, it was on that 70th anniversary, over 1,000 young Roma from all over Europe came there, and it marks, I think, this moment, this event. What we're commemorating, in a sense, is not just the murder, but also the recognition of the murder. It's amazing that this day exists. That in 2015, the European Parliament declared it an official day of commemoration, so that today the European Commission gave statements. We have statements from many state bodies, and that is incredibly important for a community that remains profoundly marginalized and whose history is generally not recognized by states, in textbooks, in broader society. So this is a very important day.
Yeah, thanks, Ari. Yeah, we'll talk more kind of about the politics and challenges of recognition. I don't think I ever actually have told you this, but I was also there. We were there in the same, at the same commemoration in 2014. And that was actually, like you said, it was a life-changing moment for me as I was bussed in from Romania with 1,000 other youth from, and that was actually when I was invited to go to that commemoration on August 2nd was the first time I actually learned that Roma were killed in the Holocaust. So, you know, we talk about how this story of the Roma genocide is so stifled, and my own kind of personal experience of being detached from that history, is reflective of that. And August 2nd holds an important part of that story for me. I think the next thing that maybe before we launch into the book it would be helpful, I think, maybe for this audience to kind of get a sense of some of the terms that we use. So you really eloquently in the book talk about the different ethnonyms and exonyms, the words that we use to refer to Roma people. So if you could maybe give us a short little rundown of the terminology, that would be helpful.
Yeah. Somebody who teaches the Holocaust, I should say, this is one of the profound differences to also teaching about the murder of Jews. When one speaks about the murder of Romani people, there's a lot of basic understanding that I think we need to start with. That is often that we need as a basis for actually discussing the genocide. And I think questions of naming are one way of getting at that. So the term used by the Nazis, and the term probably familiar to most viewers, would be gypsies, which was the term outsiders used to describe the community. Has a long history. And when historians go to the archive, that's what they will look for usually. When they look for the history of Romani people throughout the centuries, they look for people called gypsies, which is an incredibly imprecise term, not just because it is not the name people give themselves, but also because it was actually a fairly vague term that was sometimes very clearly understood as ethnic, sometimes understood in more social terms, depending on location and time. The people we are talking about would have usually called themselves Roma, but also many other things. I, like other historians, try to respect how people call themselves. Roma is often used as an umbrella term, in particular in English, for all people, what's called Romani people or Romanis in the UK. There are other groups who do very often very clearly insist on being called by their distinct self-description, including Sinti. These are mostly in German lands, but also in Northern Europe and Western Central Europe, let's say, groups who call themselves Sinti. So in Germany, one says Sinti and Roma, usually. In Austria, where the larger community is a Roma, one says Roma and Sinti. And in many other countries, one just says Roma indeed. In fact, when we're talking about Auschwitz, many of the victims would have called themselves Sinti, because Auschwitz was actually 80% of the Roma deported there were in fact from Germany, Austria, or the protectorate, so today's Czech Republic. That means the majority would have also been would have called themselves Sinti. So when I speak about Auschwitz-Birkenau, for example, I often use the term Sinti and Roma, or just Sinti, when I actually know that they are only Sinti. But there are many other subgroups: Manouche in France, Gitanos in Spain, which is, since they have a distinct history in terms of the Holocaust, is not as much my subject. But one should know that it's a very diverse community, and there are diverse names, and historians will sometimes also use the word gypsy where there are communities that still use that term as well, I should say.
Yeah, great, thank you. So kind of getting now into the meat and potatoes of our conversation today about the book itself. I wanted to start where you start with the poem by the Yiddish poet Avram Stutzkever, I might be pronouncing that wrong, who you write later in the book. You say, he writes about the Roma genocide as a crime without witness. And we kind of already touched on this a little bit, but can you go deeper in and talk more about the kind of challenges for recognition that Roma faced, and perhaps posit maybe why their wartime suffering may have been so stifled. And also kind of talk broadly about how your book works to kind of correct this idea that there were no witnesses to Roma persecution. Because what a big part of the book is that there's this kind of witnessing that's happening in the archive and in testimony. So if we could kind of launch in through that kind of lens, that would be great.
Yeah. And Sutzkever was my starting point. He also, a line from the poem that opens the book is also in the title, Rain of Ash. And Sutzkever, whom some in the audience may know, is the often considered the greatest Yiddish poet of the Jewish Holocaust. He was one of 3 Jewish witnesses at Nuremberg as well. And what he wrote a poem in 1946-47 about the Romani genocide, something that very, very few people did then or later, in fact. And I also can tell you that he wrote various other poems actually about the Romani genocide as well, not just that one, but it's that one poem where very early on he wonders indeed about witnesses, but also it's really about how should we speak about the event? What does it mean? What's the right genre? what are the right words? And who gets to talk about it? And I'm not sure we want to follow his answer, his somewhat heroic answer that he came up with. But the question is also my question as a historian who is not Romani myself, Jewish in fact, following in Sutzkever's path in that sense, not with the answer, but with the question: who gets to talk about it? How do we get to talk about it? In terms of the question of silencing, we can also start with Sutzkever and with the Jewish experience, because I think it helps with contrast, really. Because people like Sutzkever and others who survived, as in his case, the Vilna Ghetto, and a few, would have struggled. They struggled after the war. They struggled after the war to tell their story. They struggled with the fact that there was still anti-Semitism where people came back. We know that many people didn't want to hear stories of Jewish suffering. They had their own stories of suffering to hear. So the fact that we are now at a moment in time where we have Holocaust museums, memorial days, and there's a place for these stories, that is the result of a long struggle. So all of this would be true for the Romani experience too. They came home to anti-Romani. People didn't stop being anti-Romani, much like they didn't stop being anti-Semitic. People didn't want to hear their stories, but their marginality was much, much more profound. Among other things, they kept being persecuted. So if we look at the great war crime trials, for example, where we have these very early moments then also of Jewish witnessing. Again, it's a struggle. And Jews are not really fully heard at Nuremberg. There's a moment, the Eichmann trial is famous, one for really establishing Jewish testimony. So there's a whole path here where these trials do eventually establish something of a very frustrating experience actually for most survivors, but still they speak there. When Romani survivors are called to these testimonies to testify in these trials, they are actually asked to testify by a state that is still surveying them. And when prosecutors want to find their witnesses, they look for the gypsy expert in the local criminal police to find them. All this is unthinkable for Jews, right? You don't, say in the 1960s, you would never have the Jew expert in the German police whom you're going to contact to get, to prosecute a Nazi criminal. So what Roma faced was a profound way in which even when they were asked to talk, as in these trials, they did it under conditions that were completely different, where it was difficult to speak. where speaking under surveillance, under permanent surveillance, under permanent continuous persecution was very different than for Jews. Their stories also didn't necessarily fit in the same way a pattern established by Jews, really, where you had a before, where you had rights, you had a history of persecution, which is a bound experience between, well, depending on where the witness it was, in Germany in 1933 or whenever the Nazis came, to the period when they were liberated, which was difficult, but then you start the period of the after. Roma weren't murdered anymore after the Nazis were defeated. But in places like France, many of them stayed in camps, in fact. They were not liberated. There is just a continuous history here that is much harder to tell, much less comfortable, I think, to tell than a history of, there's this one event we want to commemorate and look back to it, and we don't want this to happen again. Mm-hmm. And the Romani community, actually, when it started commemorating, really in the late 1970s, there was a strong civil rights movement, which was heard as well. There were civil rights leaders before this, but they were really managed to be heard by the late 70s. They didn't say never again. They rather say it has to stop, which even as they invited Jewish dignitaries to their events. So I would say they are profoundly silenced, not because there are no witnesses in the sense that there are no people who could talk about what happened. First of all, we have the Nazi documents as much as we have for Jews. And Sutzkever was part of efforts here in the Nuremberg trials, was very aware of document collections, but also the victims themselves. There were Romani survivors. And here Sutzkever was actually following in the footsteps of many others who, followed actually an old stereotype. So one thing I should actually mention is what are the stereotypes about Roma? And historically, stereotypes mix the negative ideas of criminality with a romanticism, wild, unbound, sort of primitives of Europe were also fascinating. And these things go together very often. And what we find in Sutzkever is also some of this fantasy of there's always the last gypsy. That was sort of a whole trope. You meet the last one of their kind. And so he thought about them in those respects, sometimes as tropes, not as real people, and thus didn't ask them about what happened. And that, I think, is really the big pattern that holds into the 1980s. There are people who start to understand that there's something to be known here, but the people they ask are not the people who experienced it. They are others, and they're very often Jews who are being asked, because Jews are being interviewed or interrogated under oath about their experiences, and then they're asked about what happened to what they would say gypsies, what happened to the Roma, whereas the Roma themselves were often not asked.
Yeah, thank you, Ari. Such a rich response. There's so many things. I just want to bring out one or two of the things you just said about the kind of the porousness of the edges of the Holocaust, the kind of persecution that leads up to it, and then what continues afterwards, and this idea of Roma still being surveilled. And just to kind of like hammer that point home, some of the work that I do in the secret police archives in Romania, there is a folder, and this is in the 80s, that is the Roma question, right? And they are following Nicolae Gheorghe and some of these other activists who are organizing, and sometimes organizing with transnationally around Holocaust memory. And so you see that kind of continuing surveillance even through the communist period in kind of the Eastern Bloc. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. So much we could keep talking about just from that one response, but let's plunge forward and talk about one of the other kind of major themes of the book. And one of the things that you really wonderfully do is how you kind of color in this post-war period, documenting what you call the Roma and Jewish parallel efforts to seek justice. And you talk about how this sort of unites them in new ways as kind of fellow victims. You talked a little bit about this a minute ago, but can you get into that a little bit more? Talk about the nature of Roma-Jewish interaction in the post-war period, and then kind of related to that, one of the other big points that you make, Ari, is about the kind of infrastructure of knowledge and the institutionalization of knowledge, and how history comes at a price. So I just wanted to kind of give you this opening to talk about these collection efforts, the institutions, these Jewish institutions that Roma were also appealing to, and their role in creating kind of a basis for historical knowledge that we're really kind of using today to tell these histories. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, big question. Thanks so much. And one vivid example that I often use to just open up the topic is if, let's say you were a researcher and you wanted to find a big testimony archive, right? Or you're a student who's interested in the Romani experience and want to hear testimonies. What do? And well, if you have a professor, they might point you to the biggest testimony archive we have on the Holocaust, which is the Shoah Foundation, USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, founded in the 1990s by Spielberg, and they now have over 50,000 interviews with Jews. And they have various other victim groups now, and actually other genocides there as well. In this vast archive of over 50,000 testimonies by Jewish victims, they also have over 470 interviews with Roma and Sinti. That's a pretty small part of it, of course, but it is still the largest such testimony archive you will find anywhere. A single place where they're combined from multiple origins, projects that come together here, and languages, and it's ultimately a Jewish archive in the sense that it was made to commemorate the Jewish Holocaust. It came out of actually Solomon Schindler's List originally. What we can see here is how these in this case, we can see how they're connected, and it really stands in symbolically for so many other projects where this was the case. The Romani Holocaust really became known in a profound way through the efforts of Jews to tell their own story. It's both to tell their own story, and eventually as a sort of, if you want, a subheading in what they're doing, sort of a little side project they would have is to also wonder about this other group. But because of the size of these efforts, it will really be Jewish efforts that would matter. And I tried to trace this from the very earliest period, really, could start in 1944, in fact. 45, 46, the first people who really go to Europe, who are in Europe, or go to Europe and interview people. And what I try to understand is how people start to understand that there is something to be known here. And how various Jewish interviewers start to ask questions about Roma. Eventually, these would lead to Roma appearing in some form in Jewish archives. And perhaps this is also a moment when I should highlight the massive difference between the two communities, because yes, they are both victims of Nazism. Yes, they were both seen as outsiders by many Europeans, but they are also profoundly different in spite of both of these facts. I think that they are urbanized in a different way. They have different rates of literacy, but really what I think matters most is the form of self-organization, where Jews have a long history of self-organizing in highly visible communities, highly structured communities, and by the 19th century would build new transnational communities around philanthropy very often, and eventually around politics. So you have transnational Jewish parties, you have philanthropies, starting with, in France, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, but in the US, it was crucial for the Holocaust, the Joint Distribution Committee, for example, and Canadian efforts as well. There is something here, there's a structure here that precedes the Holocaust that Jews will be able to use. Romani communities don't have that. They have different survival strategies, if you want, which do not consist of demanding recognition necessarily, the pre-war period in particular, as a group with a visible list of members, basically handing to the police a membership list of this. These are all the Roma in our country. So you end up with very different opportunities to also rebuild lives, I would say. Both Jews and Roma can rely on family networks, but Jews can rely on these transnational networks as well. And then for a judicial reckoning to achieve justice, and to have archives that really back up those efforts to seek compensation, get Nazis convicted, and just get plain recognition and their story out. So some of the stories that I traced are actually. So I introduced some characters whose stories I know. A Romani couple whose stories I know. And the reason I know them is because their histories are recorded in the oldest archive, actually, on the Jewish Holocaust, the Wiener Library in London, which started collecting testimonies during the war. And it's what I trace is really what the resources are to create these types of archives. How much do you have to pay per interview? In this case, it's 280 Austrian shillings. So $200, I suppose, in current with inflation adjusted today. And I mention the funds because the funds are really the reason that we don't know a lot about the Romani Holocaust. It's not simply that there was no framework, sort of Sutzkever's question, also how we talk about it, the sort of abstract question. And I think a lot of the debates about memory get stuck in questions of representation in a very abstract way. So you wonder what should it look like, what should a monument look like? And what I tried to look at really is, what are the resources we need to actually know anything about the suffering of others. And here, Jewish archives will be essential. One of the efforts I look at, which I found fascinating, is by a leading figure in the United Restitution Organization, which is a legal aid association, helps Jewish survivors get compensation from Germany, so they don't have to find a non-Jewish lawyer, for example, or could get scammed by anybody. So there's an association that helps Jewish survivors here. And this organization is run in Germany by a man by the name of Kurt May. And Kurt May, really starts an effort to change how courts deal with Sinti and Roma in Germany, because there was a 1956 landmark decision that Sinti, in particular, who were deported in May 1940 to the occupied Poland, were not supposed to be racial persecutees. They would not get compensation under these laws, at least not automatically, unless they prove some other things. He wanted to change this, and he had a whole campaign running using another judge whom he knew, who was essential, Theodor Adorno's cousin, who helped in various other Jewish lawyers as well, and an effort that was really possible because Kurt May had at his disposal an incredible knowledge machine, if you want. In the late 1950s, the URO had over 220,000 open files. They had more than 1,000 employees with several hundred lawyers on staff. It was these people, they could manage to actually go into the archives, create a dossier that they can send judges, that they could send friendly lawyers who would write up briefs. All of this needed resources, and the resources were there by the late 1950s. Well, because the organization had early on been supported by the so-called Claims Conference, which is an umbrella organization that helps distribute German reparations money to Jews. And then the fees that Jews would pay, between 3 and 6% of what they would get, they would have to give the euro for the support they received. So it's the fees that Jewish survivors paid that ultimately funded this effort to successfully change how German courts would deal with Romani survivors. So what you can really see are there's so many ways in which these efforts are connected, and in a sense they remain connected until today. And I will just point to this event where it's a museum that, of course, raised its funds, receives its legitimacy in large part by representing the Jewish Holocaust, the spirit of the survivors as well, but living or through the descendants, and nevertheless, then, and I'm very grateful for this, opens their gates to this other story as well. And I think this is actually, so this event itself is part of a long history of what is at very first a very problematic form of sort of problematic form of commemoration where Roma are actually not invited, but there's something happening where what happened to them is sort of documented on the side, to a moment when there is an actual dialogue happening, a dialogue that is never simply easy, that is never simply, if you want, equal, but that where all these things can be discussed, and I think that is something that really only happens over the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I'm going to kind of deviate from our map, but hearing you talk about these kind of the infrastructures of knowledge, as you kind of name it in the book, and about the way that institutions and this kind of transnational organizing is so important to within the Jewish community, that's already there, and then after they can rely on that and kind of go back to it after the war, and how Roma didn't necessarily have that. I am thinking of a situation in Romania, before World War, actually in the interwar period, there was a lot of organizing from Roma, and they had their own newspaper. There was discourse around enslavement and how they were disenfranchised because of slavery, and then not having reparations during slavery or after slavery. So there was this kind of consciousness, this kind of political consciousness that was completely squashed after the war. And then when you look at the Romani community, it's really organizing in the late 60s, early 70s around Holocaust memory, when that kind of transnational identity comes to the surface. So it's really interesting talking to you and be able to kind of compare those two different situations. But hearing this and kind of my gears turning, what I'm wondering is, how would you characterize the situation currently? You kind of talk a little bit about this near the end of the book, but can you sort of talk about what you see the sort of landscape of Holocaust memory now? Because even in the period of time that I've been in this world, maybe about 9 or 10 years, I see it change. So I'm curious, you have a little bit of a longer perspective on it. How has things changed in your opinion? Where are we now? And also, how do you feel that your book and the impact that it's making, might have on that landscape of memory? In some of the reviews that I've read and write-ups about the book, and you also you use this language too in the book, that this is about unsettling received narratives, or kind of rethinking the way that we remember the Holocaust. So I'm just kind of broadly putting together a lot of different things, but I guess what do you feel like the landscape of Holocaust studies and Holocaust memories are? Where are we going? And how does your book and telling the story of the Roma Holocaust really kind of fit into that larger picture?
So many questions and many complicated questions. I think so. When Romani memory became successfully entered this public sphere in earliest would be the late 70s, really, then it's the 80s and 90s, really, when you have debates about monuments, right? So it's around the fall of the Iron Curtain, but it's the different ways of setting up this chronology, and the chronology for the Jewish chronology is here essential also for Roma. So there's this famous NBC miniseries Holocaust with Meryl Streep, which was screened in 1978 in the US and 79 in Europe, Western Europe, and which set up a Jewish debate. And then this is also the Romani really civil rights movement can latch onto this and start explaining what happened to them with that knowledge in mind. So anything happening after that, the next 20 years or so, when you have this explosion of commemorative activities, when college courses really, and every college has to have a course on the Holocaust now. When the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. will be built and will become a model for many of the other museums, when the Shoah Foundation will start collecting its testimonies, tens of thousands of volunteers really going out and interviewing people, people in families interviewing their grandparents. In that moment, you had several debates in Holocaust studies. I don't want to bore people with functionalism and intentionalism. There were various debates, and the moment, so many of these debates nevertheless congealed also about questions of Jewish uniqueness, or the uniqueness of the Jewish Holocaust and the Jewish experience. And I think we really have to understand why that discussion was there. And that is because it was such a struggle before. Because when the paradigm in many European countries was, there was a great political struggle, and that was actually East and West. You know, it was either a great anti-fascist struggle or it was an anti-Nazi struggle. And the political resistance is really what matters. Jews had very little space to really discuss what happened to them, much as Roma did, with the exception of Jews in Roma who happened to be communist resistance fighters, say. But for the majority of people, given what they had experienced and why they had experienced it, there was no space. So it was a struggle to come up with, to really establish this narrative and this term, the Holocaust. And that's what really, so by the 1980s, these Jewish functionaries, historians, intellectuals understood that they had reached something. They managed something here, but it was also fragile because it was new. And there was a sense, if we let other people in, who knows what's going to happen. And in part, there was also an argument of, well, who should we let in? Well, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., Polish groups said, well, we had a genocide. Ukrainian groups said we had a genocide. And then Roma said it. And if you let in the Roma, you have to let in the Ukrainians as well, or Poles. There was a whole sense of, well, we're just going to say this is unique. In the case of Roma, there was an understanding they should create what is ultimately a small nook in the museum, which we now understand to be inadequate, which we hope will be revised. But it comes out of that. What happens subsequently is really that you see a pluralization, I think, of the stories that we tell. These debates of the 1990s were so scarring, and a lot of the activists, the older activists, remember these days very, very well. And I think that actually all activists know of these debates because they always continue in some ways where you have a competition of memory around these things. So what we do see is a diversification. What we don't have is a new master narrative, I believe. Of course, there are always new books coming out, new survey histories, but ultimately, I don't think we have anything that moves beyond. There's the Jewish Holocaust, and then there are the others, and now we're going to tell more of the other stories as well. And I should say this is also how I got to the book. Like so many others, I was trained as a historian of Jewry, I should say. I teach the Holocaust, and my students sign up for a class on the Jewish Holocaust, and I was trained to teach the Holocaust. And then, like so many other people, I know that there's something I'm supposed to be doing, I'm not sure how to do it, but I'm supposed to be talking about these other victims as well. And then you just put them next to each other. And there are ways of thinking about the racial state, etc., to bring them together, but really it remains a Jewish narrative that is the main hook here. So since you attached that question of how do I think we should rethink the Holocaust here, my sense is, even as we've pluralized this story, we are still missing how this knowledge is being produced. So let me give you, it's a longer answer, I'm sorry, but let me give you an example of how the narrative of the Jewish Holocaust really influences what we know of how we tell the story of Nazi persecution. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, they had measures against Jews very early on. April 1st, 1933, there's a first boycott of Jews. There will be anti-Romani measures as well. And 1935, the first municipal camp is being constructed for Roma. 1936, multiple cities in Germany, Berlin, Cologne, Düsseldorf, Duisburg, Frankfurt, multiple cities have these municipal camps, partially constructed around the time of the Berlin Olympics. Jews seeing this happening did not perceive this as unusual. Like in many Olympic games, there's a tendency to clean up the city, and whatever that means, well, nobody wants to ask what it really means. There's a sense that what happens to the Roma here is just what happens to Roma, or they would say what happens to Gypsies. It's sort of their expectations that have been some form of internment also in World War I for some groups. There's a sense that, well, is this really revolutionary, right? The boycott of Jewish stores, that's revolutionary. But are these camps really revolutionary? And these Roma here are facing collective internment before Jews are, I should say. But there was no awareness of Jews at the time of that. The result of this is that when Jewish survivors started to write the history of the Holocaust, they also didn't see it as part of their history. And the non-Jewish historians who eventually, as good historians do these days, turn to testimony to understand what the victims think. Turn to Jewish testimony and again didn't get that story. The result is that when you think of the chronologies of Nazi persecution, these camps don't come up. They will come up if you look at the specialized history of the Roma, but they will not come up in our master narratives. So I think an integrated history really has to start from the fact that the story of one group alters, influences how we tell the history of the other group. And that's what I try to do. So it's if you want, attempt to write some of that integrated history, but also to set up the foundation, to set up an understanding of what the basis is of writing any such history. Really understanding how these are not simply equal histories, because the way they are conveyed to us are so fundamentally different. Mm-hmm. So that's where I see what I'm doing and where I see Holocaust studies now as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Ari, I'm just thinking of how we started the conversation with the poem, and you said his question is my question, which was how do we get to talk about it? And that's really kind of where we ended, with kind of thinking about how these symbiotic history, there's this relationship between Jewish and Romani histories, that there is a give and take, and I like how you put it, that it influences each other, and we see that in the book, and what you shared with us so generously today. I want to, we could keep talking, I think, for hours, but I want to open it up to our audience. If there's any questions, we have about 10 minutes for questions. If there's any, I'm happy to field the questions from the audience now. So
I know many people asked about Avram Sutzkever. I saw that in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
So it's depending on how you call him, Abraham or Avram, Sutzkever, Sutzkever in transcription. Kever. I don't know if I can type it into the chat too. But there are various new translations also of his work. So for those who expressed interest in his work, his poetry is incredible also in translation.
Great, thank you. Yes, we've put the name in the chat so folks can Google. And then we have two questions. I'm just going to ask the pair of them and you can answer both of them. The first one is from Kenneth Berlin, who asked, can you talk about the Roma Ukraine experience before, during, and after Second World War? Mm-hmm. So I think it's about Roma in Ukraine before, during, and after the Second World War. And then Lindsay Rockbrand has a question. How did you train to become an educator on the Holocaust?
So the Ukraine, I should say, I'm not an expert on that geographic area. The Ukrainian history is also part of the Soviet history, of course, and so the Soviet Union had an affirmative action program, if you want, for various minorities. This is in the 1920s, is also the period when the Yiddish press would flourish briefly before being suppressed again. And the Soviet Union had an attempt, basically, I mean, which would be mirrored actually in the post-war period in other European countries, to uplift Roma and to make that, and to actually advertise that as proof of how their system of governance can really uplift even the most downtrodden. So you have Romani sovkhozes, collective agricultural settlements. You have a theater actually in Moscow, Teatr Roman, which exists until today, a national theater of Romani culture. In its worst crisis, actually, here again, same story. A Jewish director was running it in the 1920s. And in part, really, it's I would say that here the emphasis on you have to preach communism in the language of the masses is really what makes them turn to both, well, Romani as a language and Yiddish as a language of the masses in the 1920s. During the Nazi era, many of these measures will also make them more of a target, in fact. Also similar to Jews, where the Jew is something you would have in your internal passport, which was not a problem for Jews in the 20s. And then would make them easy targets for the Nazis. Tsigan or Gypsy in the internal passport, or living in a sovkhoz might do the same. I should say, when it comes to Ukraine, much like these other areas, the fate often has to do with German administrative practices and divisions. Southern Ukraine, for example, was taken by Romania as an award. It became known as Transnistria, an area. And Transnistria, I should say, returning perhaps to my topic as well, is the area where numerically would have most deportees who are both Jews and Roma at the same time. So both Roma and Jews in largest numbers are really overlapping there together, not necessarily in the same camps, but in a larger area and just meeting each other in transit. And then in the post-war period, I believe it's largely also a Soviet story of how the Holocaust is narrated, and which is also, if you look at how Jewish survivors speak about what happened to them, depending on where they live after 1945, their stories will be very different. There will be a good number living in the Ukraine also think of themselves as having participated in the Great Patriotic War and will have different narrative than Jews who ended up in the United States, who ended up in Israel or France or UK, or Canada for that matter. So I think each community develops other stories, and here I think the Romani community will have partially worked within a Soviet narrative. That's really I do know we have actually. So as far as testimony, since one question was also testimony that we started out with, were Soviet special commissions going into these areas, and there are excellent historians who have worked through these archives due to the war between Russia and Ukraine now, I'm not sure much is happening. But before the war, there were people really finding many various Romani testimonies about the murder of Roma in these Soviet documents that deal largely with the Ukraine and some other areas that were incorporated into the Soviet Union. And then the other question was how I became a Holocaust educator. I mean, I'm actually trained, I should say, in Jewish history, not in Holocaust studies, sort of narrowly conceived, which is sort of more my identity as somebody who thinks about the Holocaust in larger historical contexts, not like for other events that create, whole libraries, like the French Revolution. There are specialists who spent their whole academic life researching only that one event and having debates with other people who, study the years 1790 to 1791. Or in this case, it would be 33, 39 to 45. And I am actually not one of them. So my first book was on the 19th century. But like so many people in Jewish history, it really, I mean, I even in grad school, I already taught the Holocaust, and eventually I taught it also. I've been teaching it for 15 years now. But coming out of really broader questions in Jewish history, I would say.
Great. We are running low on time, so I'm going to quickly try to get a couple of things out of the way. I just wanted to add to your response about Roma in Ukraine. I'm more of a specialist in Romania, but I think a recent study that I think Magda Matake headed with the Auschwitz Museum, they did a kind of Holocaust memory analysis in Southeastern Europe. And, from my own research and from that report, one thing to note is that the strong impact that that communism had on Holocaust memory in Eastern Europe. So in those countries, Holocaust memory in terms of Jews and Roma really kind of ceases to exist during. There's no mention of it in kind of state-sponsored school curricula. There's no commemorations that happen. It's really a taboo subject that's not talked about during those years of authoritarianism. We have questions about art, about institutions, museums, where we can see art by Roma, and what are some of the, so we have some responses in the chat. I'll also just mention the name of Adlina Sherban and Mihaela Dragan. Both of them are Romanian Romani playwrights and actors who work on bringing forth the memory of the Romani genocide through their art. So those are two people that folks can Google. Ari, I don't know if you have other ones to add.
Just because it's on right now, the Cheia Stoica exhibit at the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York. And Cheia Stoica is an amazing, was an amazing survivor. She passed away actually fairly recently. And she wrote her memoir in the 1980s, and really was groundbreaking. A Romani woman who told her story, and kept speaking into the 1990s. And so she's also has paintings and drawings, and those are exhibited now. So that there are various events, and I should say there are also online exhibits. There's so if you look up something called Rom Archive, and you can throw that into your search engine, you will find a digital archive that has historical documentation, but also has quite actually focuses on also artistic representations of the experience. I think that yeah, you'll find more there than many tracks you can follow up on on that website. And should I type that into
I did type it, but I realized I'm just sending it to Kat. So maybe Kat can send it to those. So Rome Archive and ERIAC, the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. Those are two good resources for folks to check out more. I think that maybe is a good place to kind of start wrapping things up. I just really want to thank you, Ari, for how generous you are with all of your knowledge. It's really a joy to talk to you. I learned so much. I've got a full page of notes to go back to. So really, thank you. And I think thank you also to our audience for being with us and participating with the great questions. And yeah, I'm going to pass it back to Kat.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ioanida. Thank you.
Kat, you are muted, just so you know.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much to both of you for this amazing discussion. We'll be sending out a post-event survey as well as some information on where you could buy Ari's book, and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.